Hello and welcome to our debate on the motion civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Before we jump into the content, I wanted to clarify that the speakers in today's debate are assigned their positions, and no lines of argumentation they make correspond with their actual, personally held values. Also, in the true British parliamentary style, every speaker was given only 15 minutes to prepare their topic before the debate began. So please, when reflecting upon the speeches we give, reflect in that context. Also, today you will see a modified version of the British parliamentary format, as opposed to the Lincoln-Douglas format which you probably saw before. In this format, speakers are given 7 minutes with a small grace period, and are able to accept points of information, which are brief interjections from the other side into their speech. This format was chosen because it allowed us to include more speakers from my debate team, and also allowed us to engage in more diverse lines of argumentation, meaning that anyone who watches this video and wants to learn about how to argue this topic effectively can see multiple speakers' approach to the topic and choose what suits their style the best. I hope you enjoy the debate. Without further ado, I would welcome our Prime Minister, Cora, to the floor to begin their speech in defense of the motion, civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Cora, you have 7 minutes on the clock. Begin when you're ready.
Hear, hear. A change is a-coming. We here on Side Proposition strongly believe that civil disobedience in a democracy is justified. Before I move into my positive matter, I have some modeling. First, civil disobedience. It is a refusal to follow laws. This is non-violent acts which break laws. Democracy. A government is a democracy that strives to be a democratic republic in the modern day. We see that no country is a true democracy, but that many are striving for it, and thus we consider them to be a democracy. Now, justified. Here we see justice as being an increase in justice and equality. These are the kind of effects that we see through civil disobedience. Okay, into my main arguments. I have 3. Faster progress towards equality, accountability in government, and voting rights and influence. Faster progress towards equality. Here we see this as rights attainment. What we're using here as a metric on proposition here today is consequentialism. What we have seen before every major increase in rights in the United States and frankly throughout the world, it is based on civil disobedience, bringing information to the forefront and action then being taken. What does this look like? This looks like sit-ins in diners in Jim Crow. This looks like women protesting outside the White House and going on hunger strikes. Now it looks like sit-ins at universities and marching to bring attention towards issues. What we see through this civil disobedience is it brings issues to the forefront that others may not realize are even issues. For example, individuals in the West Coast or the North in the U.S. may not have understood what was going on in Jim Crow era South. And that kind of information brought forward people who are willing to help join the movement and create social change. This link story is how the work of an individual or groups of individuals are able to promote the social change. Without civil disobedience, information did not make the news. It did not break the aura of the white man mentality of thinking everything's okay for me, so everything must be okay for everyone. Thus, we speed up rights attainments because people know about it, because they're thinking about it. I'll take Joel.
So I'm curious, under that first point, all of the clauses and all of the examples you used were in the past tense. I'm wondering, under your framing of democracies in the modern day, if you have any examples of civil disobedience that has been effective in producing this social change that you talk about in democracies today.
Yeah, in the wake of some of the more recent civil disobedience about race, we have seen a decrease in mandatory minimums. We have seen more police training. We have seen the use of body cams more widely established within the U.S. In places like Canada, and even Alaska, we have seen a greater increase in how individual police officers treat individuals who are Indigenous or First Nation. We see this kind of change happening progressively in the status quo. Okay. The second main point was accountability in government. Government can be thought of generally as quite a monolithic organization. But when this kind of civil disobedience occurs, the government and the people become aware of issues and are able to push for change. We see this as being things like Brown First Board of Education. We see issues relating to maternity leave or to how prisoners are treated in prison. This awareness coming to the government, creating change. And this then increases a public pressure for change to occur, right? First is making sure the government knows that something's wrong. Second is making sure there's change. And this change comes from public pressure from those outside of the government. And this is where the civil disobedience comes in. Because when individuals are acting in a civil disobedient manner, there are individuals who want it to stop. And we see that the easiest way, especially when it comes to an expansion of rights, an expansion of justice or equality in our society, the easiest way to get to stop is to make the change that people are asking for, especially over time as pressure builds amongst the government. A good example of this is the Montgomery bus boycott, right? It lasted for almost a year. It took time for change to occur, but the change did occur in the long run as pressure continued to mount. Before I get on to my third contention, I'll take Henry.
There are many other avenues through which people can pursue change. Look to voting, look through convincing their fellow members of society, and look to exerting social influence on things like corporations. Why should we pursue illegal actions that fall under civil disobedience before these?
It's wonderful you asked about voting rights because that is my third contention, so I'll move right into it. So, we see in a democracy, voting can never, and an individual's influence can never be truly obtained. That's why we're looking more at democratic republics. We see that money in election gives a great deal of voice to individuals, out proportionate to other people. This can be the same as who's making the media. Some civil disobedience makes media much faster than someone saying, here, let's please change to answer the POI, right? This is an action that grabs attention that can then bring media to an issue. But then the second part of this argument is disenfranchisement, right? A lot of these acts are moving towards wanting to allow more people to vote in a legalized manner. Because in the status quo, people like felons are unable to vote. Acts towards allowing those individuals to vote, or acts like clearing the voter rolls, right? Removing people from being able to vote so that they are no longer able to participate. These are the kinds of voting rights and influences that we see being harmed in the status quo that civil disobedience can allow for change for. Once an issue is known, work can be done to change it. This looks like many other examples, but my time is almost up. So what have I told you today? I've given you a solid model with definitions. I've talked about how through our side we get faster progress towards equality, accountability in governments, and voting rights and influences. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister for that fine speech. At this time, I, the Leader of Opposition, am going to take the floor in order to build the opposition case against the motion at hand. Democracy is built upon an ideal, the idealized premise of working together without discord or violence for collective well-being, and settling the disputes which typically cause that violence peacefully. Through the mechanisms of votes, public discourse, and private action, we have historically been able to settle our differences and create a more just and equitable world. However, violence, or even non-violent but illegal action, spits upon that premise of democracy and leads our society towards the discord and enmity of our history. Ultimately, we agree with the majority of characterizations brought by the opening government. However, we would like to offer some of the more harmful counter-narratives associated with civil disobedience. This is not always the sit-ins organized by Martin Luther King. It also manifests in a whole lot of very harmful ways. Look to the 2020 COVID pandemic, and when we saw people protesting mask mandates by standing out front of their capital without wearing a mask and leading to a measurable bump in the number of COVID cases. We think that this represents the worst, most harmful kinds of civil disobedience, and that largely civil disobedience, while not violent, does create discord and enmity within our society. It can be harmful, and it can prevent the functioning of our world. What I intend to do today is first establish a moral counter-narrative, talking about what we should prefer to the consequentialist framework brought by the opening government. Then I'm going to tell you how specifically our ability to change the world around us without civil disobedience fails that moral framework, before finally I engage directly with consequentialism, telling you how even if you don't buy this unique moral framework, it is still not pragmatically valuable to engage in civil disobedience. So first, the counter-narrative of morality. Specifically, we on the opposition support the idea of a social contract. Looking back to that premise of a more perfect democracy that I was talking about at the beginning of my speech. Fundamentally, that premise is what was the product of all Enlightenment values in the United States. It is the idea that the legitimacy of our government is derived from the individual. And at that point, the individuals of our society are given certain rights, but in turn take on certain burdens. And so while you are given protections by the government, the right to use government resources, and the right to affect your government through a vote, you are also bound by the laws of our government, and you create an agreement with your fellow citizens that in order to benefit from the government which those citizens help create, you will abide by our laws, you will pay taxes, and you will surrender certain rights. At the end of the day, the rights and duties which are established apply equally to all citizens. And when some engage in these rights and engage in these duties, while others engage in civil disobedience and flaunt the law, they are breaking their word to their fellow citizens, they are violating the contract, and that makes it both morally illegitimate, but also socially disastrous. Fundamentally, if there is any other recourse to change in your society, then to break this contract which you have made in good faith with your fellow citizens and to which they more often than not adhere, then you are fundamentally engaging in a moral sin. I'll go ahead and take you, Brynn.
Justice and equality are inherently a part of any reasonable social contract. When the government violates that contract first, why can't people violate it in return?
Because in general, we don't believe that the government is violating that contract. We think that so long as the government provides you, as I was saying, recourse to change, the government is not depriving you of your right to self-determination and power to affect the government. So let's look to that idea of recourse to change. Moving on to my second contention, how specifically do people, even in imperfect democracies such as the United States today, have sufficient recourse to change to ensure that it is not morally legitimate to engage in civil disobedience? First, I will discuss the political dimension, then the broader social dimension. So on the political dimension, there are two ways through which we can affect our government. First, through our individual votes. And our government has gone to a great distance to ensure that every person is able reasonably to engage in free and fair elections. We have many tenets and more being passed every day within our Congress protecting individuals' rights to votes, and also the states have followed suit in the vast majority of cases, even the greatest limitations through law on our right to vote are relatively easily overcome. Most Americans are able to very easily vote, and even those who have some obstructions can realistically access that right. Also, you have rhetoric. You can capture the votes of your fellow Americans. Whether it's the pure rhetoric of Dr. King's speeches or the news coverage of the atrocities committed against that movement, we realize that we are able to influence the hearts and minds of others and therefore gain political favor even when we do not occupy the majority. But even beyond that, the social dimension. Realize that there is great power to affect the lives of everyone in our society by influencing our social power. Look to when Facebook was pushed to banning the president from their platform after his rhetoric before the Capitol insurrection. It was the social power of liberals within our society that were able to effect that change because Facebook was afraid of things such as boycotts. The opening government actually brings boycotts as a legitimate action to facilitate social change. At that point, we realized that they were both powerful and legal, and therefore do not fulfill the criteria for civil disobedience. And at that point, we would encourage people to participate in protests, but realize that anything further, without having tried all of these other recourse for change, would be morally illegitimate. So very quickly on perceptions and consequentialism. This is responding to the opening government case. First, on the perceptions in society, we realize that the harmful perceptions associated with a blatant disregard for social norms under the law inherent in civil disobedience encourages first blatant abuse of the law within its members, looking to like the people who are using the BLM protests in order to legitimize their looting, but then also encourages violent responses by the opposition looking to the insurrection from the right. At that point, we realize that perceptions of society are degraded by civil disobedience, but we also realize that perceptions of the movement are sabotaged for stalling long-term progress, doing things like legitimizing police responses to these protests because people are outside of the law. At the end of the day, because it violates our social contract and there is other recourse for change, we realize it is morally illegitimate, but even if you prefer consequentialism, it is still not pragmatic. Thank you. At this time, I would like to welcome our Deputy Prime Minister, Brynn, in order to continue the government case in support of the motion. Hear, hear.
What you just heard from opening opposition is an unrealistically positive view on the state of any democratic republic right now. I'm going to bring you three main ideas. First, let's address this idea of the social contract theory and how it applies to the debate. Second, I'll tell you about why you should prefer consequentialism and vote for the government under the consequentialist model. And then third, I'm going to kind of talk about what you've heard in the debate so far and summarize it. Okay, so first, Henry brings you this idea that we should prefer the social contract theory, and that to the extent that the government has not violated the social contract, that people do not have the right to violate it either. 2 points on violating the social contract theory. First, I'd argue that as soon as there is injustice or inequality or lack of government accountability, the government has violated the social contract theory. So to the extent that we think violating it is all that's required for people to then participate in civil disobedience, then it's perfectly fine for them to do that. But then secondly, Henry brings you this idea that if there's recourse available other than civil disobedience, that it's not morally justified to participate in civil disobedience. And then Henry tries to paint you this picture that recourse is available. Couple of points on that. First, Cora brought you this idea that people don't have equal ability to participate in society right now and equal ability to actually influence government. Cora told you a couple of ways that happens. The first is with people literally being disenfranchised to vote. Recognize I only got to the right to vote about 2 years ago, and for the first 18 years of my life, me nor anyone else in the United States actually has the right to vote. But it's beyond just that. people who live far away from poll places like often don't have the ability to get there. There's just not the transportation available, and they don't have that kind of time in a day. Even if you do have the ability to get to the poll place, you might not have the hours that it takes in some places to wait in line to actually be able to vote. Like, these are all very real problems. And then you've got other groups of society who literally just don't have the right to vote. People who aren't citizens yet. People who are felons in many states just are completely disenfranchised. I'll take Henry.
Here in Alaska, there are more than 16 villages which have fewer than 3 year-round residents who all get their own polling place because the federal government goes to such great lengths in order to ensure that all people have a right to vote. We spend billions of dollars in censuses and voting programs. Why is that insufficient? And moreover, why does that constitute a violation of the social contract?
Look, recognize that some of the 3 people villages in Alaska might have polling places or a plethora of polling places, but that's not the case in many places in the lower 48, particularly in the South. That's why we hear stories every election of either hours worth of lines or of people just not having the ability to get to a poll place in the first place. These are very real problems that people face. Okay, so all of that is reasons that you should consider the social contract to have been violated. But regardless of that, we don't think that it actually even requires taking away the voice of people in order for people to be able to be justified with civil disobedience. There's problems that people have that need to be addressed, and the best way to address those often is to get attention. Not everyone has millions of dollars to throw towards promoting something with the media or towards getting a lot of influence on a problem. What a lot of people have is just the ability to organize, the ability to speak out, and Henry talks about that, speaking out and just going somewhere and talking is enough. But that's not enough to actually get any kind of real attention. To get real attention, you have to have either news media attention or some other form of spreading information to the masses. That's not available to most people, but it's much more available with civil disobedience. When people choose to hold protests even after their permits have been denied, that is much more effective than people just waiting around and saying, well, that's not going to work, so I'll just go give a speech to no crowd whatsoever. Not this time. Okay, so for those reasons, you should find that the social contract has been violated, and that regardless of whether or not it's been violated, civil disobedience is morally justified. But I think you should prefer a consequentialist model. Recognize the point of a democracy or a democratic republic is to promote kind of the good for all people and to give people things like equality, justice, and government accountability. And that those things are best achieved when you look at a consequentialist model to determine whether or not they're actually happening. To the extent that somebody is willing to get thrown in jail to draw attention to the fact that not everyone has the ability to vote, we think that they're doing society a great service by sacrificing themselves or some of their time towards promoting an issue that's actually very inherently necessary to have a good democracy. To the extent that people choose to engage in that, you're getting something, and they're actually the ones giving something up, not society. Okay, so we think that with civil disobedience, you get 2 distinct advantages that you're not going to get on the opposition side. The first is that you get a lot more attention to issues. It's a much more interesting story when somebody gets arrested at the end of it. And then secondly, that you get much quicker justice or equality as a result of that. To the extent that, often the kind of problems we're talking about might even just be with city governments, routinely denying permits to particular types of organizations, to particular movements, and that you're not going to get the same kind of attention if somebody just shouts about how they were denied a permit versus if the protest actually goes forward without that permit in place. And so as a result, you get much quicker attention, and as a result, people are able to like promote much quicker action to actually solve the problem. And so for those reasons, civil disobedience is justified either under a social contract theory or the preferred consequentialist approach. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that incredibly powerful speech, Brynn. Joel, you may take the floor whenever you are ready.
What I'm going to do in this speech is threefold. First, I think it's necessary to establish a decision-making criteria. Then, I want to talk about, respond to some of the problematic ideals that we get from both the previous speech and government bench as a whole. And then, for my split today, I'm going to directly talk to you about consequentialism, why civil disobedience still falls even if you buy into the consequentialist framework. So first, let's talk about frameworks. I don't think that any like real moral justification debate always ends its roots in justification. I think that a fair metric for this debate is that any team that can win to you on both consequential and non-consequentialist grounds should win this debate. This rhetoric is apparent in the previous speaker when they directly attack Henry's social contract, or at least attempt to, and justify civil disobedience in both the social contract and in consequentialist ways. So that's going to be your decision-making criteria for this round. So first, let's get into a couple of responses. First, on the responses to Henry's social contract. And government claims this idea that as soon as the government, like, as soon as there is injustice, that directly civil disobedience is justified. I think that this is not true for a couple of reasons. First off, even if there is injustice, they don't explain to you why civil disobedience is the only course of action that is required for individuals to make tangible change. In my split today, I'm going to talk to you not only about why other mechanisms are preferable, but also why they're more effective in the long run. And on this other idea, they say that there isn't other recourse available for change, specifically because individuals are disenfranchised in the status quo. A couple of responses. First, in Henry's case, he does not only outline votes as the only recourse for change. He explains to you why rhetoric, boycotts, and protests are valid forms of change that we get no response from the government bench as a whole. So you're going to flow those through as other mechanisms for change and other mechanisms for change that I'm going to expand upon in my split. But we don't think that disenfranchisement is the only mechanism for changing the status quo, and that shows why civil disobedience should only be used as a last resort. Government has to show to you why boycotts and protests are ineffective and why we have to prefer civil disobedience in every case for it to be morally justified. And I don't buy this. Now on their solvency, right? They claim that the way to solve problems in the status quo is to get attention, and the only way to get attention is for individuals to get arrested at the end of the movement. I think that this is problematic at the point at which, like, it's not only about individuals getting arrested. Like, Henry explains to you why civil disobedience justifies brutal police responses. So it's not just individuals getting arrested, it's individuals getting harmed. And at the point at which you're like forcing these individuals to be a martyr to like further your movement, I don't think that can be morally justified, and I don't think that it is morally justified. So before I move on to my split and explain to you why this fails under consequentialism, I'll take the POI from Brynn.
Yeah, sure. We'll tell you why that's morally justified. Because somebody chose to engage in that protest. Like, we don't necessarily think that the police responses are appropriate, but we don't think that police responding inappropriately is a reason to not protest in the first place. We think that's, in fact, a reason to protest.
Yeah, and we would agree with that too. We think that protesting is fine, right? The point at which we draw the line is civil disobedience. Like, individuals who sign up to like civilly disobey probably did not sign up to be thrown into jail or to be beaten, right? And at the point at which I'm going to show to you now that other mechanisms are more effective in producing change, like you can't justify that morally. So let's talk about consequentialism, which is a moral ethical theory that focuses on outcomes, right? And like the base root of consequentialism is in utilitarianism, which deals with the reduction of suffering in the status quo. And this is what brings me to similar outcomes, because if there are similar mechanisms to produce the same outcome that doesn't enforce suffering on individuals, then those options that don't cause direct harm or suffering are not only are morally preferable, but the one that does cause harm cannot be morally justifiable. So let's talk about these other mechanisms that are better, right? Henry explains to you a lot of social movements like boycotts and protests that are effective at producing change in the status quo. I don't buy the government's characterization that the only way to produce change is through media attention, at the point at which silent and peaceful protests have been effective at change in democracies. In recent years especially, you can't buy that civil disobedience is the only way to produce change in the status quo. But we also think that civil disobedience can cause harm to individuals. First, directly. Reference Henry's example about individuals protesting the mask mandate. That's a form of civil disobedience that government has to justify and hasn't responded to adequately. But we also think that civil disobedience can cause indirect harm to individuals. One, directly to the individual for causing that individual to break harm. Henry explained to you why this violates the social contract, not only to the government, but to your peers as well, who are equally permissible in the social contract, but also in the normality of breaking laws as mechanisms for change. We don't think that the mentality of breaking laws for change in the status quo is a preferable one because it degrades our perceptions of society, which is not helpful in maintaining order in society, which is something that individuals strive for. The question on whether or not civil disobedience is morally justified, you have to ask yourself whether it's being used as a last resort or a first resort. And I don't think that government has explained to you why it's being used as a last resort, right? We think that there are other mechanisms of change. We're going to talk about some of the political ones, right? Because we think that voting is something that is underutilized in society today. Like, not because of disenfranchisement, but because of laziness and individuals not being willing to participate in the systems. Sorry, Cora, I'm past time. But at the point at which voting has been historically low, but individuals are participating in civil disobedience, shows that this is not being used as a last resort. We also think that peaceful protesting under reasonable permissions of the law is a mechanism that exists in our society that individuals can freely participate in, that has brought real tangible change. At the end of the day, because civil disobedience can cause harm to individuals' character, but society at large as well, because there are other mechanisms that produce less harm that are equally able to produce, we find that civil disobedience is not morally justified in democracies. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that debate. If you did, please let us know what you liked about it, or if not, what you didn't, in the comments down below. We chose to make this second video because of a very nice comment on our first regarding our first video's use in a debate class. Knowing that our content is of value to people who want to watch it is what encourages new channels like ours to keep going. So, your comments really do matter and let us know that it is worth producing these videos in the first place. Once again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.